Olá, muito bem-vindos a este Cruzoé Entrevistas. Hoje nós vamos conversar com a coronel Nina Sharvit Baruch. Ela é uma antiga chefe da área de advocacia militar do Exército de Israel, das Forças de Defesa de Israel. Ela se aposentou já há algum tempo e hoje é pesquisadora-chefe do Instituto para Pesquisa de Segurança Nacional. É um think tank importante nessa área de pesquisas sobre direito e guerra em Israel. Então, eu vou fazer essa conversa em inglês. A gente vai providenciar, obviamente, todas as legendas para vocês. Eu vou dar boa noite para a Coronel Nina. Colonel Baruch, how are you? Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I would like to start with a very simple question regarding your background and what exactly an advocate general does in the military of Israel.
So I was for 20 years. I was in the International Law Department in the IDF. And I was doing a lot of giving legal advice to the commanders and to the government on issues pertaining to laws of armed conflict, laws of occupation, international law general. I was also a member of the peace delegations, negotiating with the Palestinians since in the Oslo period, since 93. I was in 94, I was legal advisor of the Paris Protocol on the economic relations. I was legal advisor in 95 of the civilian annex of the interim agreements. I was really involved since then in all the levels of negotiation, trying to solve the conflict. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to do that. It's a very complicated conflict. And then I was involved a lot in advising on operational issues when we have legal advisors involved in preparing the plans and operations and the questions about means and measures. So we have legal advice there in general, but when there is an ongoing operation or war, as we have now, so there are legal advisors advising the commanders 24/7 in shifts about the legality of the operations, because it's very important for us to abide by the law. And I was in charge. When I was still in the military, I was in charge actually of this apparatus of legal advisors giving operational legal advice. I retired in 2009, and since then I've been a researcher, researching, teaching on these aspects, both of international law and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm also involved in track 2 negotiations with the Palestinians throughout the years. So that's my background.
Very, very well. This is very important to know that there is a legal advisor working with the troops that are on the ground. I suppose that they're working before the troops go to the place and during also, right?
Well, we have legal advisors beforehand, as I said, they're involved in the different plans and questions about means and methods. During an operation or war, the legal advisors, they are there only from the division level up. We don't have legal advisors actually with the forces. It's more on the command level and the general chief of staff level, and also in some of the divisions. So it's more in places where you have time to make decisions. The troops themselves are they have we instruct them with the laws of armed conflict. They just have to implement these principles while they are fighting, but they don't have a legal advisor with them.
There are no legal advisors embedded in the okay.
Yes.
So give us an idea of what it is to advise on a war like the one that is happening right now in Gaza. What would be the measures that you would have to advise the commanders on?
Yes. So when we are facing this kind of war, so first of all, there's the legal framework, the general question about the legality of the use of force, which in this case is quite clear, and it is very clear that Israel was attacked in a very broad, a very wide-stretching attack, very vicious, very fatal, and I think there's the idea that we can resort to force, and that there's a military necessity to eliminate this threat is quite understandable, and so the legal equation there is not so big. But what is more where the legal questions do arise is with regard to the targets. What can you target? What can you target? Applying what is called the principle of distinction, the issue of precautions, the obligation to take feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians, and the principle of proportionality, how to make sure that we abide by the principle of proportionality when we are carrying out attacks and operations and military operations. And there's also the issue of the humanitarian aid. What are exactly our obligations in this regard? So all these kinds of questions raise also legal questions, and we're there. I mean, I'm not there anymore, but we have the legal advisors also to assist the commanders in seeing how to apply the law into this very, very, very difficult situation.
Is there anything similar to this on the Palestinian side? Were you ever able to negotiate or to talk to legal advisors to the Hamas?
So no, we have to understand, first of all, we have to differentiate between different Palestinians. And I think also it's important to emphasize we are not fighting against Palestinians. I have friends who are Palestinians. I was supposed to be this week in a track 2 in Europe, talking with Palestinians about how to solve the conflict. So this is not against Palestinians, and I still believe that we have to find a peaceful resolution to this conflict. The Hamas, I think, is an enemy of the Palestinians, not only of Israel, at least of any moderate Palestinian who wants to live peacefully. And they have no regard to the law, of course. It's they carry out war crimes. They've done that for years, but I think 3 weeks ago, the war crimes and the crimes against humanity, even genocide that they carried out, is something that we didn't really believe possible. I mean, we knew that the Hamas is a terrorist group, but we didn't understand that it is so linked to, in its ideology, to ISIS, and even I would say to Nazi thinking, because the brutality of what they did, they entered into Israeli villages of peaceful people in the morning and entered into houses, tied up the parents and the children and tortured them, literally tortured them, and then murdered them, or burnt people alive, or cut up a belly of a pregnant woman and took out the baby, chopped heads off. I mean, things that we couldn't even believe. It's difficult to believe that this kind of cruelty exists in the world. And then also where they have been continuing to fire rockets on a daily basis to try to infiltrate. There's a lot of fighting going on the ground, and they're continuing to threaten that this is just a beginning. So this is, of course, all these things are terrible war crimes, and they also kidnapped 240 or more, I think, already, Israelis and foreigners, by the way, also Thai workers, and they are holding them hostage, including a 9-month-old baby and 30 children, including a little girl who lost both her parents, and she's there with the Hamas, including elderly people. So this is, of course, another war crime and crime against humanity. And on top of that, they are also using their own civilians as shields, which makes it very difficult for Israel to fight there. But it's also a war crime in itself. So they are also carrying out a war crime towards their own people. And that's why I'm saying they don't represent the Palestinian. They're not there for the good, to make lives better for the Palestinians. They are using Palestinian civilians as a pawn in their fight, which is aimed at the destruction of the state of Israel. So the law is just used there as a means of fighting Israel. It is used against us because we are trying to abide by the law, because we do want to abide by the law. So they actually use this wish of ours and the law, they use it against us in order to make it difficult for us to fight them and still gain legitimacy, which is so important. So this is a tool of warfare for the Hamas.
Okay. One problem, let's say, of this war is that the whole area of Gaza is enclosed. So people cannot go in or out from Gaza. This is a siege. by the laws of war, is it legal to make a siege like this one?
Yes, first of all, but let me explain first. First of all, there is some kind of misconception that Gaza is an enclave inside Israel, and maybe just to make clear that Gaza has a border with Egypt, and that Gaza isn't occupied by Israel. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005 in the disengagement with the idea that they will rule have their own lives. There was a lot of money brought in to invest in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas took control in 2007, and all the money that was invested into the Gaza Strip went to its military capabilities. We've seen what these capabilities are. And they had an open border with Egypt that isn't under Israeli control. And that's how also they got a lot of the weapons and equipment that they used against us, either above or underground with the border with Egypt. After this brutal attack of the 7th of October, Israel did say first of all, we are closing the borders with Israel because Israel was allowing people from Gaza to come and work in Israel. It was the largest number of workers coming to Israel since 2004. There was a movement of trucks. There were plans actually to have a joint industrial and commercial area between Gaza and Israel in order to improve the economic situation of Gaza. One of these projects was led by, including a joint project on sewage, was led by one of the people, Ophir Lipshin, who was murdered brutally by the Hamas fighters, or by Hamas terrorists, that came to Israel. So this was, it wasn't a sealed off area. Once this attack happened, Israel said, well, first of all, we are stopping, we are not allowing any entry, we are stopping, we are not giving, we don't have an obligation to supply the enemy with anything. We are closing also, and trying to also close the Egyptian border so they don't get military equipment in, weapons and supplies. But we are enabling, which is the only obligation to the enemy civilians, is to enable the entry of humanitarian aid necessary for the survival of the civilian population. And this is done through Egypt under the laws of armed conflict, which is the relevant legal framework, or IHL, International Humanitarian Law. The same thing. There is this obligation, but you're allowed to put conditions to make sure that that whatever goes in doesn't go to the enemy forces. It is allowed to put a siege on the enemy forces. You're allowed to starve enemy forces, but you're not allowed to starve the population, and you have to make sure that the population gets, as I said, the basic needs. And so we are doing that, despite the fact that still the Hamas takes control of the supplies that enter. There's no deep obligation, by the way, to have fuel go into an enemy territory, especially when we know that it is used by the enemy. The Hamas has a lot of fuel. It has stolen what was in the hands of UNRWA, the UN agency that was meant for hospitals, for the generators of hospitals. The Hamas came and robbed that fuel for its military purposes instead of going to the hospitals. UNRWA tweeted about that and then deleted the tweet. And we don't have an obligation to supply our enemy with more fuel to fight us. There is enough fuel. The obligation of the Hamas, with the de facto government, is to let enough fuel for the civilian needs. Of course, it's not doing that because, again, its aim is not to improve the situation of the Palestinians, but to destroy Israel.
Another thing that is very controversial is that Israel told the civilians living in the northern part of Gaza to move to the south. And some people describe this as a displacement of people and so on. So what is the legal framework for this kind of action?
Yes. So yes, it is very important to understand this. There's a lot of misconceptions about what's happening in Gaza. Israel, as I said, found itself under this attack of the Hamas, and this means that the Hamas, we now understand, we always knew it's a threat on Israel, but now it is clear that it is an existential threat on Israel in two levels. First of all, what the Hamas did, it managed to enter thousands of people into villages and they destroy them, and even the ones that are not destroyed are now evacuated. We have over 120,000 Israelis, internally displaced people in Israel that can't go back to their homes. And the Hamas is continuing to threaten every day that this is just the first stage. We are still going to continue, and the idea is the destruction of the state of Israel. So this is a very, very big threat on our security. And in addition, the Hamas is linked to this axis of countries where Iran, of course, plays a pivotal role through and has its proxies, Hezbollah in the north, other Shiite groups all around the Middle East. And we know that they are waiting to see what will happen in this front between Israel and the Hamas. If Israel is perceived as weak, as unable to meet the threat of the Hamas, then the Hezbollah, which is much stronger and has more capabilities, will enter into the fight. We already have had missiles fired from Yemen, from the Houthis that are proxies of Iran, and we have also already clashes on the north in the Lebanese border, in the Syrian border. This could be an attack against Israel from all fronts, and Israel is a small country. We are less than 10 million people. We are a very small country, and this could be an existential threat. We feel that our lives are under danger. It's not, I'm not exaggerating. So why am I saying all this for your questions? Because once we understand that this is a threat, we have to eliminate this threat. How to eliminate it? By eliminating the military capabilities of Hamas. There's no peaceful way out of it. It's not as if the Hamas wants to compromise, and it's not about the 1967 occupation. The only compromise is that we surrender and they leave the country, all of us. So this is what they want. So now to get to the military infrastructure of the Hamas, all the military infrastructure of the Hamas is embedded inside civilian buildings and under civilian buildings in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is densely populated. There's a web of a network of tunnels under all this built-up area, and they operate from there. Now, how do we manage to get to the military infrastructure of the Hamas and dismantle it? We have to attack from the air and also by ground forces this military infrastructure part by part. And since this is all populated area, and we know that when we attack this kind of infrastructure, which is legally becomes a civilian building that is used by the military, is legally becomes a lawful military objective. Okay, so under the principle of distinction, we are allowed, it is legal to attack, to target a building, a civilian building, a school, a mosque, a house, even a hospital under certain conditions, if it is used by the military for its of the enemy for its military purposes. So we are attacking these targets, but there are many civilians there. And we don't want to kill civilians. We don't want civilians to get harmed. So one of the ways to do that, and that's again an obligation to take feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians. So one of the precautions is by warning them and telling them, leave this area. And since we started with the focus on the north, where the activity is closest to Israel, we told the civilians in the north, go. Israel said, go south. We opened channels to go south. We are organizing areas in the south where they have the humanitarian aid. Hamas doesn't want that to happen. So it stops them on the way, it forces them back, it fires at them, and then says that Israel is firing at them. And many civilians still stay in this area, unfortunately. But the idea of warning them, and many have left, is exactly actually fulfilling an obligation to take physical precautions, and it is not an internal displacement, it is not a collective sanction. We have no interest in harming the civilians in Gaza. It is against our moral and legal principles, and it is against our interest. We know that when there are civilian casualties on the other side, there's more pressure on Israel to stop its military action. So it's tying our hands. We have no wish to have civilian casualties on the other side. So this is with regard to the warning. And then maybe I can address the proportionality, because that's the next principle. Because as I was saying, so the laws of armed conflict have two main principles. One is the distinction, which I explained, and we are not targeting civilians, and we are not targeting civilian objects. We are targeting military objectives, those that are used by the Hamas, and its operatives that are always wearing civilian clothes. So they also look civilian, but they are members of the fighting forces of the Hamas, so they are also lawful targets. And we are giving precautions. But then when we attack according to the laws of armed conflict, even when you attack a lawful military objective, you have to take into consideration the principle of proportionality. And we have to understand what does it mean and how do we implement it here. So the principle of proportionality says that when you attack a military objective, you have to take into account what would be the collateral damage to harm to civilians expected from the attack. And if you expect that there is civilian harm, that civilians might get killed, it doesn't make this attack unlawful. It's only unlawful if the expected harm to civilians from this attack would be excessive in relation to the military advantage that you're expecting from the attack. So let me explain again. When we attack this military infrastructure of the Hamas that is threatening our existence, each part of it is part of this infrastructure. We have to think, what is the military advantage? What is the expected civilian harm to civilians? Civilians that will be killed and injured. And then we have to balance the two. Because the military advantage at the moment is so high, because this is a question of our existence, even if we know and expect that there might be many civilian casualties. And I'm saying this is a tough thing to say, and the laws of war are not, war is a very messy and unfortunate business, but even if we know that civilians might get harmed, this does not make it unlawful if this would not be considered excessive. So extensive harm to civilians is not necessarily excessive. It is always with comparison to the military advantage, to the threat. And here I say, because of the situation in Gaza, that is so complicated, and the fact that Hamas uses the civilian infrastructure, uses the civilians, prevents them from leaving, operates from within the civilians, there is no way to eliminate the military infrastructure of the Hamas without also causing this incidental and very unfortunate harm to civilians. We don't want it to happen, but we don't really have an option. There's no other way of dismantling the military infrastructure of the Hamas. If there was, we would take it.
And how might this question of the proportionality be raised by international entities, and how would then it be evaluated? How would the Israeli forces defend themselves, and what kind of evidence would they have to give to prove that they did it in a proportional way, even though civilians were dead because of the action?
So you're touching on a very difficult aspect of it, because it is very, very difficult. You know, we have this legal framework. We apply the laws. By the way, we consult during the years with legal advisors from other militaries. We and the other militaries of the US and Europe and UK and NATO, we have the same principles, the same manuals. But still, it is very difficult when you come to the legitimacy front, to the international arena, to the international media. It is very difficult to explain or to make them understand the situation, because you see pictures of devastation in Gaza, of many casualties, and also we know that the Hamas also doesn't always, I would say it gently, is not also accurate with the figures. So we had a very, first of all, a very famous case of this hospital where they claimed that Israel bombed the hospital and there are 500 people killed, and there were already riots around the world against the Israelis and Jews, and then it appeared that it was actually the Islamic Jihad that fired a rocket that fell short, hit the hospital's parking lot. There were also not 500, but only 50 people killed, but anyway, it wasn't Israel. But of course, the figures are not the real figures. A lot of the rockets fall short and kill Palestinians, but of course this is counted as if Israel did it. And also there's the whole question of who's a civilian and who's a combatant. I've heard that in Jabalia yesterday or last night, there've been hundreds of casualties on the Palestinian side, but nobody mentions that within this number, and I don't know if this is the accurate number, but we know of dozens of Hamas fighters, Hamas operatives that was there. It was a stronghold of the Hamas. And just to make that clear, we had 13 soldiers killed yesterday in this fight and many more injured. So this is not entering a peaceful area and just bombing it just because we want to kill civilians. This is a combat zone. And so the numbers, first of all, include also Hamas fighters. It is not clear if these are the numbers. But anyway, again, as I said before, even if I'm not saying that no civilians are harmed. I know that there are civilians are harmed, and it is a sad thing. It's sad when children are killed on both sides of the border. It is sad. But again, this does not mean that it is a war crime on the side of Israel. We are trying our best not to harm civilians. But if anyone has a solution how we can get to the Hamas that is operating from civilian areas, that is using the civilians as shields, that is trying to destroy us without any harm to civilians, then I ask anyone that has the solution, come and send it to me. I will give it to my government immediately. And I would also ask all our listeners, if it was Brazil that was facing such an attack from an enemy that says we're going to destroy you, and that has already proven that it can, that came to villages and butchered Brazilian innocent civilians, and is operating and using the civilians of the other side as a shield, what would you expect your government to do? To do nothing? To say, oh, since that's the only way, civilians will be harmed on the other side, I will do nothing, I will surrender, I will let them come and butcher my civilians. The laws of armed conflict acknowledge this complexity, and there's no obligation on the state to commit suicide.
Can you walk us through the process that I know that you did not take part in this because you're retired and you're out of the military, but give us an idea of what happened before the decision to attack this area where you knew there were many terrorists, but also many civilians. So what were the steps from a legal point of view that were taken until you reach the decision to really attack?
So of course it starts with intelligence of where do we estimate that the forces of the Hamas are. And again, since our focus is on dismantling the military capabilities of the Hamas, that's the focus. Beyond the legal and the moral issues, there's no strategic logic in wasting ammunition on civilian objects that have no military purpose, that have no military importance. So the idea is to try to identify where are the strongholds of the Hamas, where are the most important, their most important capabilities, and how can we get there? And then in order to eliminate this infrastructure, we need actually a combination of aerial attacks, and these aerial attacks cause a lot of harm because, as I said, most of this infrastructure is under the buildings. So to get to under the roads, under everything, to get to this infrastructure, we have to sometimes destroy buildings, or you're trying to get to the underground tunnel, but it does destroy the buildings above them. Also, the Hamas uses a tactic of booby-trapping buildings, sometimes intentionally, that if we attack one place where we know there's a military target, it would lead to another building on the other side to collapse because they do these connections, these booby traps, again, because they want as much harm as possible to put the pressure on Israel. And then you try to estimate how many civilians are there, and you warn them, and you try to make them leave the area as much as possible. And then you have this proportionality analysis. And we know, for example, that the main headquarters of the Hamas is under the main hospital in Gaza, the Shifa hospital. Under the laws of armed conflict, the hospital can also be a lawful target. If it is used by the military, it has a special protection. You have to give the enemy the possibility to stop its military use. But if it continues, you can even attack a hospital. But here again, the proportionality analysis would make it very difficult to attack a hospital. And Israel hasn't until today attacked the Shifa hospital, despite the fact that there's a huge military advantage from getting to the headquarters of the Hamas, because the harm to civilians would be very, very big. So there is really a question of proportionality. So you have to do this analysis with regard to each attack separately, but you are allowed to take into consideration the military advantage, looking at the campaign as a whole. So we are looking at each part of this military infrastructure, but eventually we have to see how we manage, by attacking these different parts, manage to dismantle this threat of the Hamas, its military capabilities, and the threat that it poses upon us, and the threat that if we don't do that, we will have all these other enemies coming in for the kill. So this is also, we are allowed to take that also into consideration. This is an existential war. We are fighting an existential threat, and that also impacts how much force we are allowed legally to use.
Very well. I would like to talk about another very complicated concept. And I will bring it on because Brazilian President Lula used the word in a recent press briefing. He said that Israel was doing genocide inside Gaza. And he meant it as advice, stop doing this genocide, something like that. But anyway, the word popped up. So what do you have to say about this, the use of this word, genocide, regarding what is happening right now in Israel and in Gaza?
I think what the Hamas did when it tried to destroy people just because they're Israelis and Jewish, not only Jews, by the way, they also murdered Arabs and foreign workers. They had a genocidal intent. It also appears they actually declare it. They are saying, we want to destroy the state of Israel. We want to destroy the Jews. When they are chanting around the world, free Gaza, not free Gaza, free Palestine, from the river to the sea. When you see all these slogans against Israel and against the Jews, there is a genocidal intent. Israel has no genocidal intent against the Palestinians. We do not want to destroy the Palestinian people. We have not done anything even close to that. All our conflicts, we are trying to minimize the harm to civilians. I explained why we cannot prevent harm to civilians, but there's a big difference between what the Hamas is doing, intentionally targeting civilians in Israel, both what they did on the 7th of October, and since then, firing rockets at Israeli houses, at hospitals, and what Israel is doing, which is fighting the Hamas forces, trying to minimize harm to civilians, with no intention to harm the civilians. That's the opposite of genocide. So, and you look at the figures, the Palestinians haven't been, the numbers of Palestinians have been diminished in recent years. They have been growing. We tried time after time to reach a peaceful resolution of the conflict. It is a very, very difficult conflict to solve. Part of the difficulty is that many in the Palestinian side, those that, for example, support the Hamas, and the Hamas is popular on the Palestinian side, and it's become even more popular now, they don't accept the right of Israel to exist. So it's not about finding a solution to the 1967 occupation, which I believe we should. It's about, from their point of view, finding a solution to the 1948 conflict, and the solution that they offer is that Israel ceases to exist. So when this is at stake, it's very difficult to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict when the other side says, yes, the resolution to the conflict is that you stop existing. We still believe, and I still believe that there are Palestinians there, and I know them, they do believe that we need to reach a compromise that will enable us to live peacefully side by side. These Palestinians are the enemies of the Hamas. The Hamas would kill them before they would kill me. ISIS killed more Muslims than non-Muslims, and the Hamas would do the same. So we have to understand this is not a war between Israel and the Palestinians, or between Israel and the idea of some rights, national rights for Palestinians, and it is not a war that is intended to keep the occupation alive from the Israeli perspective. This is a war between Israel and the Hamas and other terrorist organizations that don't believe that Israel has a right to exist. So when we understand that, I think talking about Israel committing a genocide of the Palestinians, when we are trying not to harm them, and they are declaring that their aim is to destroy us, is again twisting things. And we have this it's very frustrating how the world just gets things completely the opposite than the truth.
From a legal point of view, what does it take to frame a crime as a genocide?
So you need to have the intent to destroy a certain group because of its identity, and you'll have to excuse me, I don't have here the wording of the crime, and it can be an attempt to do it even in a certain area, and it can also be an intent even if you don't succeed in doing that. That's why what the Hamas did in Israel on the 7th of October fits into the crime of genocide, but it for sure also fits into war crimes and crimes against humanity. Again, the murder itself, the brutality, the torture, inhuman treatment. There was even mass rape cases, unfortunately, beheading of babies, really, and kidnapping. As I said before, kidnapping people, including children. These are all war crimes, crimes against humanity, maybe even genocide, which has more conditions to enter into that crime. But again, the Hamas doesn't care. I mean, the last thing they care about is the law.
Another very common accusation against Israel is that it is a colonial power, and it has implemented some sort of apartheid. What's your answer to these two ideas?
Israel, the Jewish people have been persecuted for years, and of course the Holocaust was the, proof of that. And we always had links to the land of Israel. It appears in the Bible. These links, they appear in all the prayers, in all our. And I'm not a religious person. I'm a secular person. But in all our holidays, we talk about Zion. This is in our tradition. So there is a historical link to the land of Israel. And after the Holocaust, the world accepted that the Jews maybe also have a right to a country of their own, like almost any other nation. And the United Nations gave and accepted that there will be a state here, a Jewish state, next to a Palestinian state. So we have a right to be here. This is not a colonial enterprise. Since 1967, we do control the West Bank. We controlled also the Gaza Strip, which, as I said, we stopped controlling in 2005. And there is the issue of how do we settle that conflict there. As I said, I'm from the peace camp. I believe that we need to find a way to give the Palestinians living in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip a way to fulfill their right of self-determination. We have to find a compromise, but this compromise cannot be at the expense of Israel's right to exist. So as long as the majority there are not ready to just find a solution of two states living side by side peacefully, but want to eliminate the state of Israel, are not ready to recognize our right to exist, then we cannot solve the conflict. And there's no apartheid. I mean, Israel, we have almost 20% of the Israelis, of the citizens of Israel are Arabs. They are a central part of our everyday lives. We have doctors and engineers and nurses and everywhere. I mean, in my institute, we have Arab researchers. In the academia, of course, they have full free rights, and the Hamas was trying to make the Israeli Arabs join the fight, and the Israeli Arabs said, no, we are Israelis, and we deplore what you did to our brothers and sisters. And as I said, they also murdered Arabs. So there's no apartheid inside Israel. There is a complicated situation in the West Bank. You do have different systems, but because there is a Palestinian Authority that was created in the Oslo agreements that I mentioned before, I was a legal advisor there. So they rule the Palestinians on most aspects. And we and the Israelis living there, the settlers, have a different system, but it's not apartheid. It's two different systems because we have two different administrations that are there. Is there things that we can improve with regard to the way the Palestinians in the West Bank are treated? I think there is. I have my criticism on my government. I did not vote for this government. But this does not mean that Israel is an apartheid state. This does not mean that we are carrying out genocide. This does not mean that we are some lawless country. This means that there is a complicated conflict that we need to solve, but it is very difficult to solve it.
Very well. So I thank you very much for your answers. It was quite enlightening. A lot of doubts I had, you helped to solve. I wonder if you have any other short message to leave.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, I'm talking to anybody in Brazil who is listening to us. Please help us. Help us fight terrorism and call terrorism when they do things like they did, and help us with the hostages. There is no reason that children, the babies, that elderly people are held by the Hamas without even a sign of life, without allowing them to meet the Red Cross. This is a crime, but it is not moral. And if the world and people around the world say something about it, the Hamas will, I think, take that into consideration. They do not like this comparison to ISIS, although they are ISIS. So really, you can help. You can help save a child's life, save these hostages, and please help us.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was very nice talking to you.
Thank you.